The $43 rifle. The Red Cross truck arrived at Camp O'Donnell on a Tuesday morning in late July 1943. Its canvas-covered bed loaded with parcels that represented the outside world's stubborn refusal to forget the men imprisoned within the bamboo walls. Private First Class Danny Kowalski had stopped expecting anything months ago. His family back in Detroit probably assumed he was dead, another casualty of the disaster at Bataan. The humid Philippine air hung thick with the smell of cooking rice and the ever-present dampness that rotted everything it touched. "Kowalski! Daniel J!" came the call from the camp clerk, a thin Japanese corporal who pronounced American names with careful precision that somehow made them sound foreign. Danny stepped forward, his worn boots squelching in the red mud that never quite dried. 8 months of captivity had taught him to move slowly, to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. The package was wrapped in oiled cloth, heavier than he expected, with his name written in his younger brother Mickey's familiar scrawl. Attached was a letter that made his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Thought you might want to do some hunting when this whole mess is over," the letter read in Mickey's cheerful, oblivious voice. "Saved up my factory pay and got you something good from the Sears catalog. Can't wait to hear about all your adventures." The other American prisoners gathered around as Danny unwrapped the package in the sweltering barracks, their faces a mixture of curiosity and hollow-eyed exhaustion. What emerged was a modest bolt-action rifle, a Remington Model 700 that his brother had ordered from a Sears catalog for $43, complete with a basic 4X scope that had probably cost another $15. In the context of their captivity, surrounded by bamboo walls and the constant presence of armed guards, the weapon seemed almost absurd. "Jesus, Kowalski," muttered Sergeant Bill Morrison, a career Marine who had lost 60 pounds since Bataan. "Your kid brother sent you a mail-order pea shooter. What's he think this is, summer camp?" The other men laughed, but it was the bitter laughter of soldiers who had learned that humor was sometimes the only thing standing between sanity and the abyss. Corporal Jimmy Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco's Chinatown, shook his head. "Danny, that thing couldn't drop a deer at 50 yards, let alone do any real damage." But Danny Kowalski had grown up hunting whitetail in the forests outside Detroit, and he recognized quality when he saw it. The rifle's action was smooth, the barrel properly crowned, and the scope, while basic, was clear and well mounted. More importantly, he understood something his fellow prisoners didn't. In their current situation, conventional military thinking meant very little. The Japanese guards had barely glanced at the package during their cursory inspection. To them, it was just another harmless memento from home, as unthreatening as the photographs and letters that occasionally made it through the censors. They had moved their camp twice in the past month, apparently in response to increased guerrilla activity in the region, and the guards were growing more nervous, more unpredictable. Danny wrapped the rifle back in its oiled cloth and tucked it beneath his sleeping mat, along with the single 20-round box of ammunition that had been packed beneath it. Mickey's letter he folded carefully and placed in his shirt pocket next to the faded photograph of their family standing outside the Ford plant where their father had worked for 32 years. That night, lying on his bamboo sleeping platform, while monsoon rain drummed against the barracks roof, Danny thought about the October mornings when he and Mickey would slip out before dawn to hunt the woodlands north of Detroit. The patience required, the steady breathing, the gentle squeeze of the trigger that meant the difference between success and going home empty-handed. He had never imagined that those skills might someday be called upon for anything other than putting venison on the family table. The rifle disappeared into Danny's meager possessions, and for 3 weeks nobody mentioned it again. The daily routine of survival, finding ways to supplement their starvation rations, avoiding the attention of particularly cruel guards, caring for the sick, consumed every waking hour. The war felt distant here, reduced to rumors and the occasional sound of aircraft passing high overhead. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. What happens when the ordinary tools of home meet the extraordinary demands of war? The morning of August 28, 1943, began like every other morning at Camp O'Donnell. The 5:30 wake-up bell echoed across the compound, followed by the shuffle of weakened men organizing themselves for roll call. Danny had been dreaming of his mother's kitchen again, the smell of coffee percolating on the stove, bacon frying in the cast-iron skillet that had belonged to his grandmother. Dreams of food had become both blessing and curse. They provided escape, but made the watery rice gruel of reality that much harder to swallow. "Attention! Formation!" The command came in heavily accented English from Sergeant Yamamoto, the senior guard who supervised the American section. He was a stocky man in his 40s who had once mentioned during a rare moment of conversation that his own son was somewhere fighting Americans in the Solomon Islands. The prisoners arranged themselves in ragged lines. Danny noticed that Morrison was favoring his left leg more heavily than usual, probably the recurring infection in his foot that the camp's minimal medical supplies couldn't properly treat. To Morrison's right stood Private Henderson, barely 19 years old, who still maintained the rigid posture of military training despite 8 months of captivity. "Today, work detail on the airfield," Yamamoto announced. "Construction continues. Emperor expects progress." The airfield project had been the camp's primary focus for months. The prisoners labored daily under the blazing Philippine sun, moving earth and laying gravel for what would eventually become a Japanese fighter base. It was backbreaking work made worse by inadequate food and the tropical diseases that swept through the camp with depressing regularity. As they marched toward the worksite, Danny found himself walking beside Chen, whose family had run a small restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown before the war. Chen spoke fragments of Cantonese, which occasionally proved useful when dealing with some of the guards who had served in China before being transferred to the Philippines. "You ever think about that rifle of yours?" Chen asked quietly, keeping his voice below the guard's hearing. "Sometimes," Danny admitted. The truth was that he thought about it often, especially during the long hours of labor when his mind wandered to escape the physical discomfort. Not as a weapon that seemed impossible, but as a symbol of his brother's naive faith that everything would return to normal. "My grandfather used to say that the gods send us what we need, even when we don't know we need it," Chen observed, shouldering his pick. "Maybe Mickey knew something you didn't." From his position on the watchtower, Danny could see Lieutenant Sato, the camp commandant, observing the work detail through binoculars. Sato was a career military officer who ran the camp with methodical efficiency. He was neither particularly cruel nor particularly kind. He simply followed orders and expected others to do the same. Danny had noticed that Sato seemed tired lately, spending more time studying reports that arrived by motorcycle courier from the regional headquarters. The work proceeded slowly. Henderson collapsed twice during the morning, his 19-year-old body finally succumbing to months of malnutrition and dysentery. Each time, Morrison helped him to his feet, whispering encouragement that would have sounded absurd to anyone who hadn't lived through what they had lived through. "Come on, kid," one foot in front of the other. "We're going home," Morrison would say, though his own faith in that promise seemed to weaken with each passing day. During the midday break, as the prisoners sheltered in whatever shade they could find, Danny overheard 2 guards discussing something that made his stomach clench with sudden tension. They spoke in rapid Japanese, but Chen caught enough to translate later. "They're talking about increased guerrilla activity," Chen whispered. "Something about moving the camp again if the situation gets worse." "How much worse?" Morrison asked, his Marine training making him naturally interested in tactical intelligence. "Bad enough that they're worried about a direct assault," Chen replied. One of them mentioned that another camp was overrun last month. All the guards killed, prisoners liberated. The idea of liberation had become almost too dangerous to contemplate. After 8 months of routine and gradual adaptation to their circumstances, the thought of sudden freedom felt more terrifying than hopeful. What if rescue came at a price they weren't prepared to pay? What if the war had changed them in ways that would make returning home impossible? That evening, as they returned to the barracks, Danny caught sight of Dr. Nakamura, the camp medical officer, treating a guard who had injured his hand during construction work. The doctor worked with the same careful attention he gave to prisoner patients, his movements economical and professional. It was one of the small contradictions that made their situation so difficult to understand. Their captors could be simultaneously cruel and compassionate, often within the same hour. "Kowalski," Chen said as they settled onto their sleeping mats. "If something does happen, if those guerrillas do come, what are you going to do about that rifle?" Danny didn't answer immediately. He had been asking himself the same question for weeks, ever since the rumors about guerrilla activity began circulating. The weapon represented possibilities he didn't want to consider and responsibilities he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I honestly don't know. How long can a man carry a secret that might save lives, but also damn his soul?" The attack came at dawn on August 30th, 1943. Danny woke to the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life, the distinctive crack of Arisaka rifles mixed with the deeper boom of captured American weapons, punctuated by the occasional burst from a Nambu machine gun. For a moment, in the confusion between sleep and consciousness, he thought he was back on Bataan, reliving the chaotic final days before the surrender. "Get down!" Morrison's voice cut through the barracks, his Marine training kicking in automatically. "Stay away from the walls!" The prisoners huddled against the bamboo partitions, listening to the battle raging outside. Filipino guerrillas, supported by what sounded like at least a company of well-armed fighters, had struck the camp's eastern perimeter with a coordinated assault that sent the Japanese garrison into chaos. Shouts in Japanese, mixed with Filipino dialects and the occasional American curse word from guerrillas who had served with the U.S. forces before the fall of Bataan. What the prisoners couldn't see was the tactical situation developing beyond their bamboo walls. The guerrillas had successfully breached the outer defenses, but 13 Japanese soldiers had taken positions in a watchtower and surrounding bunkers that dominated the camp's main courtyard. From these elevated positions, they could pour enfilading fire on anyone trying to reach the prison barracks, effectively trapping both the attacking guerrillas and the prisoners they were trying to liberate. "They're pinned down out there," Chen whispered, his face pressed against a gap in the bamboo wall. "I can see muzzle flashes from the tower. Nobody can get across that courtyard." It was then that Danny Kowalski made the decision that would haunt and define the rest of his life. While the other prisoners huddled against the barracks walls, he retrieved his mail-order rifle and the single 20-round box of ammunition that had been tucked beneath it in the Red Cross package. The weapon had been overlooked during the chaos of the guerrilla attack. The guards were too focused on the immediate threat to worry about what one starving American prisoner might have hidden among his possessions. Moving to a small gap in the bamboo wall that faced the watchtower, Danny found himself with a clear line of sight to the Japanese positions, approximately 230 yards away. The irony wasn't lost on him. His fellow prisoners had mocked the rifle's hunting pedigree, but deer hunting had taught him patience, breathing control, and the art of the clean shot. The difference was that now, instead of 8-point bucks, his targets were human beings. "Danny, what the hell are you doing?" Morrison hissed, crawling over to where Danny was loading the rifle. "What I have to," Danny replied, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "Those guerrillas are dying out there trying to get to us." Henderson, the 19-year-old private, stared with wide eyes. "You can't just... we're prisoners. We're not supposed to fight anymore." "Tell that to the guys bleeding in the mud," Chen said quietly. He had positioned himself next to Danny, studying the tactical situation with the analytical mind that had made him a good soldier before capture. Wind's pretty steady from the left, maybe 2 clicks right on that scope. The first shot, taken at 6:17 a.m., dropped the machine gunner in the watchtower. The Japanese soldier simply slumped forward over his weapon, and for a moment the devastating fire that had been raking the courtyard simply stopped. The guerrillas, recognizing the opportunity, began advancing toward the barracks. "Jesus Christ," Morrison breathed. "You actually hit him." But the Japanese were seasoned troops, and they adapted quickly. Within minutes, another soldier had taken over the machine gun position, and the deadly crossfire resumed. Danny worked the bolt, chambered another round, and continued the grim mathematics of precision shooting. Each shot had to count, not just because ammunition was limited, but because every second of delay meant more guerrillas falling in the courtyard, and a smaller chance that any of them would survive to see liberation. Morrison found himself serving as Danny's spotter, calling out targets and corrections. "Wind's picking up from the left," he would whisper. "2 clicks right." Henderson sat in stunned silence, while Chen began keeping a count, marking each successful shot with a small notch on a piece of bamboo he had pulled from the wall. The other prisoners watched in a mixture of awe and horror as their fellow captive, a factory worker from Detroit who had been drafted 18 months earlier, displayed a level of marksmanship that seemed almost inhuman. Outside, the battle continued to rage. Danny could hear voices shouting in Tagalog and English, coordinates being called, wounded men crying for help. The scope of his $43 rifle showed him fragments of individual stories. A Japanese sergeant trying to organize his scattered squad, a Filipino guerrilla fighter advancing with a captured Thompson submachine gun, an American officer who had escaped from another camp leading a flanking maneuver. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. What happens when survival demands you become someone you never thought you could be? By noon on the first day of fighting, Danny had fired 11 shots and eliminated 8 Japanese defenders. The psychological impact was devastating. The remaining Japanese soldiers began refusing to man the exposed positions in the watchtower, forcing their sergeant to rotate men constantly to maintain any kind of defensive fire. Others started moving in unpredictable patterns, ducking and weaving, even when crossing areas they had previously considered safe. Dr. Nakamura appeared in the barracks during a lull in the fighting, ostensibly to check on wounded prisoners, but clearly aware that something had changed in the tactical situation. He was a thin man in his 50s who wore wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of a village schoolteacher rather than a military doctor. "Someone is shooting from inside compound," he said in careful English, his eyes moving from prisoner to prisoner. "This is not permitted under Geneva Convention," Morrison answered with the stone-faced expression of a career Marine. "Doc, I don't think any of us knows what you're talking about. Doctor." Nakamura studied Morrison's face for a long moment, then turned to Danny. "You are from Detroit, yes? City of automobiles?" "That's right," Danny replied, keeping his voice neutral. "My cousin lived in Detroit before war. He wrote letters about hunting in Michigan forests, said American hunters very skilled with rifles." Dr. Nakamura's tone remained conversational, almost friendly. "Perhaps when this fighting ends, we can speak about Michigan hunting." After the doctor left, Chen shook his head slowly. He knows exactly what's happening. But he's not going to do anything about it, Morrison observed. Question is why? The answer came during the second day of fighting, when Danny spotted a Japanese officer with binoculars directing mortar fire onto the guerrilla positions. At nearly 300 yards, it was the longest shot he had ever attempted, requiring him to account for wind, distance, and the slight tremor in his hands from 2 days of tension and minimal food. He squeezed the trigger just as Dr. Nakamura entered the barracks carrying medical supplies. The doctor arrived in time to see the Japanese officer in the distance slump and fall, his binoculars clattering to the ground. Instead of raising an alarm, Dr. Nakamura quietly began treating Henderson, whose dysentery had worsened during the stress of the battle. As he worked, he spoke in low tones that only Danny could hear. "Lieutenant Sato received orders this morning to execute all prisoners if camp is overrun," the doctor said without looking up from his patient. "I have argued this is unnecessary. Better to evacuate and preserve resources." Danny felt his stomach clench. What did he decide? He has not decided. But each hour that passes, each soldier that dies, makes evacuation more attractive than execution. Dr. Nakamura met Danny's eyes. Sometimes mathematics is more persuasive than orders. The conversation was interrupted by renewed fighting. The guerrillas had used the lull to reposition, bringing up additional weapons and coordinating with other American prisoners who had escaped from camps throughout the region. Danny returned to his position at the bamboo wall, where Morrison was waiting with range estimates and wind readings. 12 shots left, Morrison said, studying the remaining ammunition. "Make them count." Over the next 6 hours, Danny methodically eliminated the remaining Japanese defenders who were keeping the guerrillas pinned down. Each shot required him to overcome not just the technical challenges of long-range accuracy, but the growing weight of what he was doing. These weren't targets at a shooting range or deer in the Michigan woods. They were young men, probably with families, who had been assigned to guard American prisoners and found themselves dying for reasons they might not fully understand. Between shots, he found himself studying the letter from his brother, Mickey, reading the cheerful words about hunting and adventures and the naive assumption that everything would return to normal when this whole mess was over. Mickey couldn't have known that his gift would transform his brother from prisoner to participant, from victim to agent of his own liberation. As the sun set on the second day, the last Japanese resistance collapsed. Lieutenant Sato, faced with the loss of his entire defensive force and the approach of what appeared to be a full guerrilla battalion, made the decision to evacuate rather than fight to the last man. The remaining guards gathered their equipment and withdrew toward the jungle, abandoning Camp O'Donnell to the advancing Filipino fighters. The guerrillas entered the prison compound just after dark, led by a tall Filipino officer who had served as a captain in the Philippine Scouts before the fall of Bataan. He moved through the barracks, embracing the liberated prisoners and speaking in a mixture of English and Tagalog about the long journey to freedom that lay ahead. But Danny Kowalski sat apart from the celebration, staring at the rifle that had saved their lives while destroying something essential within himself. Each of those 13 shots represented a human being, sons, husbands, fathers, whose lives had ended through the crosshairs of a mail-order rifle scope. Morrison approached and sat beside him on the bamboo sleeping platform. "You did what you had to do, Danny. We're alive because of you." "I know," Danny replied. "That's what makes it so hard to carry. How many lives is your own conscience worth?" Freedom, Danny discovered, was more complicated than he had imagined during 8 months of captivity. The guerrillas who liberated Camp O'Donnell were part of a larger network that included escaped American prisoners, Filipino resistance fighters, and local villagers who risked their lives to support the underground war against Japanese occupation. They had been planning the assault for weeks, coordinating with intelligence networks that stretched across Luzon and into the hills where other camps held Allied prisoners. Captain Miguel Santos, the Philippine scout officer who led the liberation force, found Danny 3 days later sitting alone beside a stream where the group had stopped to rest during their march toward the coast. The other liberated prisoners had adapted to their new circumstances with the desperate enthusiasm of men given an unexpected second chance at life. They talked constantly about home, about the families they would see again, about the normalcy that awaited them when the war finally ended. "You are the one with the rifle," Santos said, settling onto a fallen log beside Danny. It wasn't a question. Danny nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "My men tell me you saved many lives, both American prisoners and Filipino fighters." Santos studied Danny's face with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read character quickly and accurately. "But you do not celebrate with the others." "I never killed anyone before," Danny said finally. 13 men. I keep thinking about their families, wondering if they had children, if someone is waiting for them to come home. Santos was quiet for a long time, listening to the sounds of the Philippine jungle around them. Finally, he spoke in the measured tones of a man who had wrestled with similar questions. "Before the war, I was a school teacher in Manila. I taught mathematics to children who dreamed of becoming engineers and doctors. When the Japanese invaded, I had to choose between collaboration and resistance. Both choices required me to become someone I had never been before." He pointed toward the other liberated prisoners, who were sharing rations with the guerrilla fighters and talking in the animated way of men who had rediscovered hope. "Those men are alive because you made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. The guards who died made the same choice from the other side. War does not care about our preferences or our consciences. It only cares about what we do when everything else has been stripped away." That evening, Dr. Nakamura appeared at the edge of their camp. He had followed the evacuation route, but separated from the other Japanese forces, carrying medical supplies and a white cloth tied to a stick. The guerrillas brought him to Santos under guard, unsure whether to treat him as a prisoner, a refugee, or something more ambiguous. "I wish to offer medical assistance," Nakamura said in his careful English. "Many wounded, both American and Filipino. I have supplies and knowledge." "You could have remained with your unit," Santos observed. "Why didn't you?" "I am doctor first, soldier second," Nakamura replied. "Hippocratic oath requires me to heal, not to choose sides in political conflicts." Over the next 2 days, as they continued their march toward the coast, where submarines would carry the liberated Americans to Australia, Nakamura worked alongside Santos's medical corpsmen to treat wounded fighters and former prisoners. Danny found himself helping with the medical work, his steady hands useful for holding instruments and changing bandages. During one of these sessions, as Nakamura worked to extract shrapnel from a guerrilla's shoulder, he spoke quietly to Danny. "You know, in my medical training I learned that precision is everything. Too shallow, and you do not solve the problem. Too deep, and you cause more damage than you heal." He paused to clean the wound. "Sometimes the most skilled hands must make the deepest cuts." "Are you talking about surgery, or about what I did at the camp?" Danny asked. "I am talking about choices that cannot be unmade," Nakamura replied. "The difference between guilt and regret is that guilt assumes you could have done differently. Regret acknowledges that you did the only thing possible under the circumstances." That night, Danny sat with his brother's letter and the rifle that had changed everything. Mickey's cheerful words about hunting and adventures seemed to come from another world, written by someone who could not have imagined the weight his gift would carry. But for the first time since the liberation, Danny began to understand that carrying that weight was part of what would make him worthy of his brother's faith. The rifle itself had become something of a legend among the guerrilla units operating in the region. Word had spread of the American prisoner who had single-handedly broken a siege with a hunting rifle ordered from a department store catalog. Some of the stories grew in the telling, reports of impossible shots, of Japanese soldiers killed at ranges that defied belief, of a sniper who could see through walls and around corners. But Danny knew the truth was simpler and more complex than the legend. He had been a skilled hunter who found himself in an impossible situation, armed with an adequate weapon and driven by the desperate need to save not just his own life, but the lives of his fellow prisoners. The rifle had been mocked because it looked ordinary, civilian, unmilitary, but war, Danny had learned, had little respect for appearances or conventional wisdom. Sometimes a $43 hunting rifle could change the course of a battle just as effectively as the most expensive military hardware. Sometimes a factory worker from Detroit could become a precision marksman when survival demanded it. Sometimes the line between liberation and damnation could be measured in the distance between crosshairs and target, between the gentle squeeze of a trigger and the irrevocable consequence of a precisely placed bullet. What is the true price of freedom when it's purchased with someone else's life? The submarine USS Narwhal surfaced off the coast of Luzon on September 15, 1943, its black hull barely visible against the dark water of the Philippine Sea. Danny Kowalski stood on the beach with 47 other liberated prisoners, watching as rubber boats moved silently through the surf to carry them toward home. The rifle that had saved their lives was wrapped once again in its oiled cloth, now stained with salt air and the accumulated grime of 2 weeks in the jungle. Captain Santos embraced each of the departing Americans, speaking words of encouragement about the war's eventual outcome and the Philippines' inevitable liberation. When he reached Danny, he pressed a small wooden cross into his hand, carved, he explained, by his grandfather, who had fought against the Spanish 60 years earlier. "For protection," Santos said, "and for remembering that some fights are worth the cost, even when the cost is everything." The journey to Australia took 6 days, during which Danny found himself unable to sleep in the submarine's cramped quarters. The other liberated prisoners talked constantly about their plans for return, the meals they would eat, the families they would embrace, the stories they would tell about their experiences in captivity. But Danny remained largely silent, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Morrison, promoted to acting sergeant major during the evacuation, approached him during the 3rd day at sea. "You planning to tell them what happened?" Morrison asked. "About the rifle, I mean." "I don't know," Danny admitted. "What would I say? That I killed 13 men with a hunting rifle my kid brother ordered from a catalog? That I became a sniper to save our lives?" "You could say you were a hero," Chen suggested, joining the conversation, "because that's what you were." But Danny understood something his fellow prisoners didn't, that heroism and trauma often inhabited the same space, that the skills that saved lives in war could haunt a man for decades afterward. The mathematics of precision shooting that had preserved their freedom would become the mathematics of sleepless nights, of calculating angles and distances in civilian situations that required no such calculations. The debriefing in Australia was conducted by military intelligence officers who wanted detailed information about Japanese camp operations, guard routines, and the guerrilla networks operating in the Philippines. Danny provided technical information about Camp O'Donnell's layout and defenses, but when asked about the circumstances of their liberation, he said only that guerrilla forces had overwhelmed the Japanese guards through superior tactics and local knowledge. The rifle disappeared into his duffel bag, and there it stayed. The transport ship that carried them from Australia to San Francisco in November 1943 was filled with wounded soldiers and returning veterans, men who had seen enough of war to recognize the particular silence that settled around those who had crossed certain lines. Danny spent most of the voyage on deck, watching the Pacific Ocean and thinking about his brother's letter, which he had read so many times that the paper was beginning to wear thin at the folds. When they docked in San Francisco, Mickey was waiting on the pier with their parents and what appeared to be half the neighborhood from Detroit. The homecoming was everything Mickey had imagined when he ordered the rifle: tears, embraces, and the desperate joy of family reunited after months of uncertainty about Danny's fate. "Did you get my package?" Mickey asked during the drive back to Detroit. his eyes bright with excitement about his gift's role in his brother's survival. "I got it," Danny replied. "Thank you. It meant more than you'll ever know." But when Mickey asked for details about Danny's experiences, about the adventures he had expected to hear, Danny found himself unable to provide the stories his brother wanted. The truth was too complicated, too dark, too weighted with moral ambiguity for someone who still believed in clear divisions between right and wrong, heroes and villains, adventures and tragedies. After the war, Danny returned to Detroit, where he worked for 37 years in the same Ford assembly plant he had left when he was drafted. He married a nurse named Margaret, who had worked in a military hospital during the war and understood, without needing explanation, why certain sounds made him flinch and why he sometimes woke in the middle of the night calculating distances to windows and doorways. He never spoke publicly about his time as a prisoner or about the 2 days when his marksmanship had meant the difference between liberation and death. The rifle went into a closet, and there it stayed. When reporters occasionally sought him out, veterans organizations wanted to honor him, military historians wanted to document his story. He politely declined their attention. The other survivors of Camp O'Donnell told the story differently. Morrison became a police officer in Phoenix and would sometimes, after a few drinks, describe the morning when a kid from Detroit turned a mail-order rifle into an instrument of liberation. Chen wrote about it in letters to his family, letters that were eventually donated to a military museum in San Francisco. Their accounts, filtered through memory and shaped by gratitude, turned Danny Kowalski into something larger than life. But Danny himself understood what his fellow prisoners didn't, that heroism and trauma often inhabited the same space, that the skills that saved lives in war could haunt a man for decades afterward. He kept the letter from his younger brother, the cheerful note about hunting when this whole mess is over. The mess had ended in 1945, but the hunting, the careful stalking, the patient waiting, the split-second decision to take a life had never really stopped. It lived in his dreams, in the way he flinched at unexpected sounds, in his inability to enter a room without automatically cataloguing sightlines and fields of fire. The mail-order rifle that had been mocked for its civilian origins had proven more effective than military doctrine, more decisive than conventional tactics, more powerful than the prejudices of professional soldiers. But it had also proven that the line between liberation and damnation could be measured in the distance between crosshairs and target, between the gentle squeeze of a trigger and the irrevocable consequence of a precisely placed bullet. In 1987, 44 years after Camp O'Donnell, Danny received a letter written in careful English. It was from Dr. Nakamura, now retired and living in Kyoto, who had tracked him down through veterans' records. The letter was brief and formal, but it ended with a sentence that Danny read many times. "I hope you have found peace with the choices that saved so many lives, including perhaps my own." Danny never replied to the letter, but he kept it with Mickey's note about hunting adventures and the wooden cross that Captain Santos had given him on that dark beach in the Philippines. Some memories, he had learned, were too important to forget and too painful to share. The rifle remained in his closet until the day he died, wrapped in its oiled cloth, a testament to the truth that sometimes the most ordinary tools can change the course of history. And sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are the ones that can never be spoken aloud. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What would you remember more, the lives you saved or the lives you took?